Good morning. So we are actually starting off our stewardship campaign. Yeah. Okay, all right. So for our newcomers who are not familiar with the term stewardship campaign, it's a time in our program year when we ask people to pledge their gifts of ministry and money so that St. Paul's Church can live out its mission of loving God and loving our neighbors. I know what you're thinking. Of all the days to come to church, why did I choose today? And it's not like NPR, you can't shut me off. And if you leave now, we're all going to know why. So I'm sorry. But let me just explain. Just give me a few minutes to explain. The question is, what are we building here at St. Paul's that anyone would want to give their energy, time, and their financial resources? Why? Let me unpack that question, explore that question by unpacking the Jeremiah reading. If you've noticed anything about the prophets, they have a certain rhythm. They give you the bad news, and then they give you the good news, right? Things are going to be really, really bad because you've been very bad people. But at some point in the future, God is going to make everything good, and you will flourish. There is this kind of familiar rhythm to every prophetic book. And in Jeremiah today, it's no exception. He has been talking about the destruction of Israel by the Babylonians and the destruction specifically of Jerusalem, God's holy city. But in today's reading, he delivers an oracle that promises restoration and renewal. And the words are very tender. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. What's surprising about this prophecy, excuse me, is that Jeremiah gives it before the Babylonians have taken over the city. It's a word about future flourishing when the city is actually being destroyed. The walls are literally collapsing under an invading force, and he gives this prophecy, a prophecy of hope. Why? Because Jeremiah, his whole life vocation is to remind the nation of its first covenant. And that's where hope springs from. And if you recall the first covenant that God makes with Israel, it takes place on Mount Sinai in the desert, where the great prophet Moses receives God's commandments. And that moment is the high point of a magnificent story of the Hebrew people gaining freedom from slavery in Egypt, an empire run by military rule and a slave-based economy. When God enters into this committed relationship with Israel, God promises them an abundant life, a homeland where they will have food, security, and community. But if the Israelite people want to be in this relationship, there are essential conditions they're going to have to agree to. One of these conditions is to respect the sacredness and limits of the natural world. Did you know that? That's one of the conditions in the covenant. And another essential condition of the covenant is not to hoard material resources, but to share them with others, especially those in need. And this emphasis on sharing material goods with the poor, with the vulnerable, with the alien, that is actually one thing that separates the Hebrew scriptures from ancient texts in that region. These two conditions find expression in the Sabbath principles, which we find in the first 5 books of the Bible. We call it the Pentateuch. You're probably familiar with the commandment to rest on the seventh day, right? Well, God also teaches people to rest from economic activity every 7 years. Exodus 23, it says, "For 6 years you shall sow the land, and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow." And the book gives 2 reasons. I mean, not just Exodus, but Leviticus, Deuteronomy. There are 2 reasons for this. You have to let the land rest if you're gonna actually survive on it. You can't just continue to exploit natural resources forever. There are limits to the created world, and you have to respect that. And you want to use the abundance, the natural growth of the land to feed people who are in need. And not just people, wild animals as well. Human work is wholly dependent on the natural rhythm of growth and rest that govern creation. If our work exceeds the limits set by nature, we're going to disrupt the fragile balance of the created world, a world that actually depends upon us. That's why in Genesis 2, God calls the first human person to keep and till the land, to be its guardian as well as its steward. Human labor also doesn't exist solely for an individual or one group's prosperity. It finds its purpose and meaning in creating a community of abundance through sharing and distribution of goods. Wealth, possessions are supposed to have a destination beyond me. That's the biblical vision. This is based actually on an understanding of creation. It's not a storehouse, nature, of resources made only for our extraction and use. It is a living organism that God pronounces as very good, and over which God has appointed human beings as protectors, so that every living being, not just us, can find sustenance and flourish. That's the meaning of God's cosmic wow in Genesis 1. God looks upon creation and proclaims it as good. Very, very good. And we're meant to be partners in protecting and nurturing this created world that is so beautiful and that is so precious in God's eyes. That is why material resources that we take from nature, food, water, and other goods, have as their final purpose not individual consumption, but the creation of a thriving commonwealth of nature, bonded by mutual care and giving. The kids are having a lot of fun. The first Sabbath law of people resting on the 7th day and remembering their essential connection to God and each other and to the natural world, that law is meant to limit human economic activity for the sake of the entire cosmos. This Sabbath principle finds larger expression in the practice of releasing people from debt every 7 years. So in Israel, ideally, every 7 years, people were supposed to forgive all debt. And then in a larger time cycle, 7 times 7 is 49 years. So in the 50th year, the nation is supposed to proclaim an year of Jubilee where they set free all slaves and reset the debt calendar so that people don't fall into destitution and the economic life can be sustainable for the long term. This is the Sabbath teaching. You might think these Sabbath principles are crazy. How, for instance, will people eat if no one grows food for a whole year? In Leviticus, God answers that precise question. And God says, "In the 6th year, I will order my blessing for you so that it will yield a crop for the next 3 years." The logic here is not to have blind faith in some supernatural provision. The logic is if we resist greed, the earth will provide what everyone needs. Right? Gandhi said, the earth can provide for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Right? It's the same principle that the Bible is articulating. So the biblical vision asks us to find our source of fulfillment in joy not in endless accumulation and consumption, but in reverencing, taking just joy in the splendor of God's creation and enjoying our connectedness to each other and to all forms of life. So this is really a different type of economic life. An economic life that's not based on scarcity, where we pit limited resources against unlimited human wants. It looks at the world as sheer gift and ourselves as God's partners in creating a sacred economy where everyone can flourish, human and non-human. And that is the human vocation, according to the Bible. And through the voice of Jesus, we are heirs to that vision. As church, we're not just a bunch of fun-loving, welcoming people that everybody wants to hang out with. Okay? We are that, okay? But we're more than that. Okay? We are given a particular and a noble vocation to create a sacred economy that reflects divine grace, the infinite, measureless gift of God's love that's being poured out on all creation each and every moment. I long, and I think so many people long, for a different way to live, economically and spiritually. A way of living that actually renews our spirit. A way of living that brings wholeness to our relationships with each other in the natural world. A way of living that actually gives life instead of taking life. We are given the opportunity to create that life in community in church. That's why the church exists, to create an alternative, sacred economy of care, reciprocity, and mutuality. And that is so necessary, so needed right now. You may think that this talk of creating a sacred economy at St. Paul's sounds grandiose, and its potential impact really questionable, given the crisis, the multiple crises that we're in as a country and the world. What impact can a small Episcopal church like ours make when the problems are so big? I don't know if our best efforts, even the wisest, most well-meaning, most faithful, will actually change anything in the big scheme of things. But what if our actions as church, as small as they seem, against such overwhelming odds, what if our actions can actually make a difference? When we look at movements like the civil rights movement or the women's movement, they didn't start with major world-changing actions. They all started with people, groups of people, taking small steps, doing small, faithful things for the benefit not only for themselves, but for all. And I know this sermon has gone kind of long, but I'm about to end, so don't worry, okay? When we look at civil rights history, 1955 marks the watershed moment when the Montgomery bus boycott sparked the national movement. But black people had been working in obscurity. To the mainstream society in obscurity for many, many decades before 1955. They laid the seeds and foundations for the movement to actually emerge at that moment in history. Did you know that the Alabama chapter of the NAACP in Alabama was founded in 1913 by a college sophomore at Talladega College? From that small start, 30 branches would form in Alabama alone by the 1940s. And also, by the way, NAACP in Alabama, that was the first chapter to begin in the Deep South. Before that, they were all up in the North. Rosa Parks became the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of NAACP in 1943. That's 12 years before 1955. 9 months before Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat, did you know that there was a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin who refused to move to the back of the bus for a white passenger? And it was a woman named Lucille Times, a black resident in Montgomery. She was the first one to stage a one-person boycott of the bus system by choosing to ride a car and taking her neighbors to work back and forth, funded by donations that her husband solicited from their neighbors. These little-known acts by black women whose names barely get mentioned when we commemorate the civil rights movement today. These women, this is not an exaggeration, those acts laid the foundation for what became the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And from that one boycott, a national civil rights movement emerged. And from that movement, the apartheid in America ended. Small acts by small groups of faithful people doing what they want to do because that's who they were over a long period of time with faith and persistence. That's what ended apartheid in America, in South Africa, and the violence in Northern Ireland. And there's so many other examples we can point to throughout history. So when I talk about creating a sacred economy at St. Paul's, it may sound grandiose. You might look at me and say, well, what good can possibly come out of that when the nation is falling apart? Just like the audience that Jesus was addressing, we have the right to ask, will God do anything? Will justice come? But when we look at history and look at the very people who are the agents of large-scale change for justice and peace, we can take comfort and say there is justice. Peace is always possible. And in time, change comes. We may not see it in our time, but that doesn't excuse us from doing our part so that the next generation can see it. We are in troubling times, but that's no reason for despair or resignation. This kind of time is exactly what training in faith is supposed to be about. You guys get what I mean? I have a friend who's a monk in Big Sur. A couple years ago, there was such a huge, I think it was a rainstorm, the highway collapsed. And nothing could get in and nothing could get out. So I wrote him and I said, Cyprian, are you guys doing okay? And he said, we're managing. And he wrote back, he said, we're managing. And some of the brothers are antsy. But I keep on telling them, this is what we train for. Like, what do you think all that praying was supposed to prepare you for? That this is exactly the moment you're supposed to meet with faith. That's what we're doing here. Training in the Spirit. Not being content with just shallow, superficial, immediate results, but we're looking long term, even to the horizon of infinity, trusting that God's promise will be realized in God's own time. We do what we do because that's who we are, people who are inspired by the love of God in Jesus Christ. That sacred economy, that vision of a sacred economy where all can flourish, that we inherited from Christ himself, that's what we're building at St. Paul's. So I ask you, help us realize God's vision by creating a sacred economy here, one of compassion and one of generosity. Amen.